some of the anecdotes that you could tell me, which would be interesting to second graders as they learn about the history of Lowell?
Well, I think that most of your second graders are familiar with the location of the Lowell Methodist Church.
Oh, yes.
And on the east side of Flat River in the city of Lowell. And when my grandmother came to Lowell, they settled up in what is now Virgins Township, right near just south of the home occupied by Charlie Pierce.
Oh, yes.
There's a little grove of apple trees there in which their log cabin stood. And Grandma went to school on the site of the Lowell Methodist Church. In fact, Grandpa Avery gave this land and for both the old Lowell High School and the land where the Methodist Church is located.
Well, now, is that the school in which Carolyn Baird taught
yes,
originally?
That's the school. It was called the Little Red School.
Oh.
And there was not even a road from their home up in Virgins Township to the school. So they had a circuitous trip through the woods on just a path. And yes, and of course they only went to school, as I understand it, just during the summer months because it was impossible to get there in the winter.
Yes, I noticed it started in May, which I thought was an interesting time.
There were times. Grandma always spoke of very peaceful relations with the Indians because Lowell was just an Indian village at that time. And but of course the white man brought in the spirits that caused the trouble with the Indians, and occasionally when they'd imbibe, why they would even waylay Grandma and take her school lunch away from her, and so she'd have to go all day unless some of her brothers or someone went along with her till they got through the Indian settlement, because they had Lowell at that time was just an Indian village.
Well, I noticed the first pupils. There were 9 white pupils and 5 Indian pupils in that first school, which I thought was interesting.
And of course, even to her old age, Grandma could write, and when I stop and think, it was just a few, maybe 6 weeks in the summertime, but her handwriting was wonderful, as they made the most of their opportunities, and I don't think that she had a chance to go to school, the equivalent would even be, what, in 8th grade now, but still, she was able to get along very well in that age in which they lived. And
I think they really worked when they went to school in those days.
They
appreciated the opportunity.
And of course later the Methodist Church was built on the same site of the old Red School. But at that time it was both that school was both a church and a school.
Oh yes, I remember that in the history of the school.
Yes. One thing that Grandma used to tell about, of course, she could dance when she was 80 years old, some of these Indian chants and Indian dances, and knew some of the Indian language.
Oh, I wish she could teach our boys. I wish she could have taught you.
Well, I wish I'd had a tape recorder then, because we've just missed a lot of this heritage. It would be wonderful to know about. But she used to tell about the Indian squaws coming to their home and borrowing sugar. And of course, the sugar that they used in that time was brown sugar. It wasn't a granulated sugar like we have now.
Was it made from cane?
Or from the maple trees,
Yeah,
there was lots of the Indians.
Like the sugar bush.
They were ones the sugar bush. Mm-hmm. And she said that her mother would take and fill this cup. They'd bring a cup. She'd fill it up and heap it up, and hand it to them. And they'd sit there in the room and take their thumbs and go and work this all down and compress it very carefully and then hand it back to them for them to refill it again. A second and third time they were going to get good measure. And of course Grandma used to tell that's one of the things that stuck in my mind as a child, some of the experiences that she told about.
Some of the old recipes, we'll say a cup of brown sugar, packed more or less. And that's what they did, I guess.
And then of course the anecdote, the climax of this was that when they returned it, paid back their loan. They didn't go to the trouble of packing it all down like they did when they bought it. But the Indians used to go and hunt, and she said that, of course, they used to come up primarily the river, Grand River, and then up Flat River, up and on back of the school now, and up about where the Atwood Brass plant is now, was about where the Indian village was and where they landed in their boats. Yeah. And she said they used to bring sturgeon that would weigh 100 pounds, almost fill a dugout canoe. And she said they would divide it up with the white people that were in Lowell, and they'd have big times up there, and then of course they'd build their campfire. And she went one time when they cooked an owl. She said they cooked it for about a week, and then they invited all the people, and she said she tried to eat a piece of it along with all the rest of them.
Must have been awfully tough.
I think it was. But that would be right on this little valley that's just east of the cemetery there, Oakwood Cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
Around Mrs. Dr. Shepherd's property. That's where the Indians used to stay a lot. It was up in on those flats in back of Charlie Houseman's. And where the Atwood grass plant is. And, of course, they were temporary. They were migrant people. They didn't build permanent homes. They came and did a lot of trapping and came up in the spring and then returned, I suppose, down into Indiana or Ohio for the severe weather of the winters. That's why we seldom find any remains of their buildings. But when I was a boy, all these old Indian trails were still, we followed them and played Indian. I like to do today, you know. All up through these, what we call the Pine Hills. In fact, that's what we used to refer to, all of those hills up in there. We always referred to them as the Pine Hills. But of course, even when I was a boy, all the pine had been cut off. And this is about the southern line for the white pine of Michigan, for which Michigan was famous. In fact, a lot of the timber was shipped from Greenville to build the covered bridges like at White's Bridge and Fallisburg Bridge, because they had more just that few miles from us than we had in this area.
And how far is Greenville?
About 25 miles, 28 miles.
Isn't that interesting? And as short a distance, there would be that much difference
in
how much lumber was available.
This was a terminal glacial area. And that accounts for the terrific change in both the soil and also all of this irregularity of our land that we find around Lowell. This was the very end of all this, and I would very much, you have to let your imagination work to stop and think what this was like back when that old glacier was moving all this soil and everything down through. But that's why you find this submarginal land. It's also why you find so much beauty here and such a variety of plants and wildlife and all of these different things. But of course, that was why the Indians came in here. It was largely for the trapping. That was their main.
Along the rivers and the lakes and this kind of thing.
And of course, practically all of their travel was by navigable waters. They were limited to where places they could get by canoe. And of course, the very earliest old stage lines followed very much just a short distance from these rivers, like the one between Detroit and Grand Rapids came right through Fallisburg, you see, and then carried on its way into Grand Rapids. Now, does this give you any idea at all?
This is fine. This is wonderful. This is exactly the kind of thing I'd like to have.
Well, of course, when my father was a boy, they were still shipping all these logs down Flat River, and these old, what did they call those? They had cement or stone-filled things in the middle of the river to control their logs, and these booms were in existence, which they'd float these logs in and sort them. And my father told about the first long pant suit that he ever bought. He went down the Flat River and they were rolling on these logs.
Oh, yes, that's quite a trick. I saw it down to
and he fell in.
Yes.
And had to go home and change his clothes. But I can still remember when some of these old boom places, there by the old, you see there was a sawmill right in back of where your secondary school is now, just west of the Runciman building.
Now, is that the one that was there in 1876? Someone had a sawmill, and, I saw in this illustrated journal, whatever that is, Mother had, there was a sawmill, and there was a picture of it. It must have been a steel engraving of this sawmill and at this man's home, and I can't remember the name. I have it here someplace in my notes.
Well, I have the names of all these people that built these first sawmills, and it was King, Quick, and King. It still goes back to King's. Some of his, the King side of their family.
Warren Babcock?
Well, that name isn't familiar to me, but I've never happened to read his name in connection with the old mill. But most of it...
I don't know, this was 1876, and this was an illustrated, I'll tell you in a minute, Illustrated Historical Atlas of Kent County, Michigan, in 1876. And it was published by a company, Blendon and Company.
Well, that was very common in those days. They used to come up with one by 10 years.
This was the man that made money.
Yes, that was right. But sometimes they use their imagination to quite an extent.
Oh, yes. Well, I know that. I know that from some of the things in our own family down in Illinois.
And, of course, this cutter company, which was built in Lowell, the old cutter factory, that's where my father worked all of his working days. And my grandfather, when he came here, he was a wagon maker. He could build a wagon from the ground up.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, that was one of the largest until the time the automobile became a means of transportation.
Now, you're like when you started out, what kind of a job did you have in that cutter factory?
Well,
and how old were you?
Well, there was no child labor laws then. I started to work when I was 11, 12 years old in the shop and went to school. And I'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and work till 8 o'clock and make 75 cents.
And then would you work after school again?
Well, no, I usually got my job done in the morning, but I did work Saturdays, and I could work a half a day or so on Saturday. But the going wage for men was about $1.75 a day. I mean, that was...
So that if you made 75 cents before you went to school with 2 hours work, that was very good.
Well, I bought all my own clothes and everything else, and bought to save money and bought expensive cameras way back then because
you were interested in photography
at that particular time. But this whole cutter, we made. Well, I was going to say we built the curved dashes that went particularly on the cutters because the buggies didn't have. They had a straight dash, and of course these were made with a bent, we called them ribs, and then this plywood was steamed in the steam box, and we put it down there. Well, I drove the nails. There were 44 nails in each one of these, and I had to start them because the men in the shop couldn't handle that, nor that rattan molding, those real small nails. So I used to brag those. I could start 44 nails a minute and put them in place before it went into the steam box, and then all they had to do was just go along with the hammer, and we made 175 a day.
Then they had, in a manner of speaking, they had a production line in that cutter factory.
We surely did. It was a forerunner of our modern automobile plants, as far as that's concerned, and they adapted. In fact, when the automotive industry first started, they came to Lowell to take several of the foremen in our shop because they were building wooden automobile bodies at that time. And the foreman of our shop went directly with Fisher Brothers. In fact, his name was Fisher.
Oh, is that where the name came from?
Well, no, he wasn't related to the same
person.
I
see. Now, by the way, who were the people who had this cutter factory?
Well, it was started by Robert Flanagan and about 3 of the Pekka Brothers. That would be Thelma Hawn's father, Thelma Peckham Hawn.
Now, she used to teach in the high school, and is still living right in Lowell now.
Although she's quite a little younger than I am, but I don't think she'd remember.
Oh, she's retired from teaching, I believe. I think I go to the same church.
Librarian in the last position.
No, I have the right one then in mind. And now, Flanagan. There are several families of Flanagan in our school. Would any of those be connected? Now, what about the Peckham? I had a Carol Peckham whose father works at Coons. Would that be the same family?
That's one of the descendants. His father was not Gurney, but well, I used to work with him a lot on making their pictures for their catalogs and all these things of this boy's grandfather.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Dick Peckham's grandfather.
Yeah.
I believe his name is Dick. I may be
wrong. Yes, they're direct descendants, and they were in charge there right up until the automotive industry forced them out of business. In fact, this Perry Carl was his name, was the one that's in Coons. That was his father's name, Perry Carl.
I see.
And he was their outside man. He did a lot of their selling because one would look after the production in the plant, and he was responsible for making new contacts and selling. And of course, that was where this connection was made with Ford. We did start building some of these little backs, wooden trucks, so they could convert a Model A Ford or Model T Ford, the little runabout, into a little truck, light truck.
Oh, yes.
But we made them of wood. We never switched to metal, or Lowell could have been a second Pontiac or a second Detroit. The opportunity was here because they were pioneers in vehicular traffic.
Well,
because we built buggy bodies for Laurel Brothers in Wisconsin, Norton Durant in Flint before they started the automobile business, the Old Michigan Buggy Company in Kalamazoo, and then of course they all switched to the automotive industry. While Lowell just phased it out. Now does this...
This is fine. This is what I like. I think this would be most interesting. This is the kind of thing to me that boys and girls in second grade can remember. I want them to leave Lowell. I assume that many of them, a large percentage of them, will not continue to live in Lowell after they become adults. But I want them to leave Lowell being very proud of this town they grew up in and knowing some of the history of it.
Well, one of the things that, of course, that we used to do, our kids played cowboy day. Every Saturday, we'd take these trips up into the old, what we called the Pine Hills, and we'd stay all day Saturday. We'd take a lunch and follow these, and we played Indian, and we'd get the pitch.
Just like boys do today.
We'd take the pitch from the pine trees and fill a cup off them like an Arm & Hammer soda can nailed on the end, and come down through the woods like that with our torches hollering at night down the old trails and with the Indian hoops, you know, and that was a lot of fun.
Now, in that area, would that be about where the Boy Scout cabin is today, back in there?
That's right. It would be on in back of that, and that's what we call the Devil's Peak is on.
Oh, yes.
And that would be right there in which Grandma was raised. Another thing that used to be these young people in Lowell don't realize today is that before we had cement sidewalks, that all the old sidewalks were boardwalks, and a lot of them were even up on sawhorses, elevated above the ground 2 or 3 feet. And of course, Lowell used to be, every spring, the kids would look forward to high water, because our rivers used to flood a lot here in the whole area of even your school grounds and through up the Methodist Church and up in that area. And of course, all these wooden sidewalks, we'd get on them and make rafts out of them and ride all over town on these sections of the boardwalk. You see, they'd break up into sections about 12, 15 feet long, and we could pull them all over everywhere. And sometimes, in the early spring, it would freeze, and we could skate. You could skate right into people's houses on the east side of Lowell, east of the schoolhouse, because the water would be 3 or 4 inches it'd flood the people out and freeze right inside of their houses. But of course,
now, they must have done something in terms of flood control or river control or something so that it doesn't happen anymore.
They did. They built well, usually this would be caused by one of these dams giving away.
Oh, I see.
Because they were all earth-filled dams, you see, and something like that would, although they have done a lot on their river to bring about river control, but of course Grand River drained such a large area, and it was where these 2 rivers came together that we ran into the trouble, because Flat River would have to back up because it just couldn't empty into Grand.
I can see that.
But I don't know whether the Indians ever experienced that back in the time when they were here, but still, when we had lots of woods, the snow didn't melt as rapidly as it did after they cleared a great deal of this land, and not only that, all of the runoff would get into the stream much faster because staying in the woods. And of course now we've reforested a lot of Michigan. This has helped a lot to stabilize the water so it doesn't.
Conservation practices,
yeah,
really.
That's right.
What do you know in terms of the history of the post office?
Well, the first post office that I recall in Lowell was the one which is the building adjoining the Christensen block, which is has the sign of it of the Old Avery Jewelries. That's not relatives of ours, but my great-grandfather built that building originally and leased it to the United States government for a post office for many, many years. And the post office was there. I don't know whether it was ever moved from that location before they built this new one or not, because we were in business in Lansing. We're away from here for 25 years, but otherwise.
Where was that first post office?
It was on Main Street, right at the east end, right where they're putting up all that new grill work. They're even going to that building and going to include this, and this new, the first is what we call the King Block, the one the Christian drugstores.
Yes.
And then this would be the old, in fact it was built by my great-grandfather.
Oh, yes.
Ray Avery, when he was there, showed me the papers and went back to this. So that's one of the first buildings on Main Street in Lowell. And of course, all those buildings are built up on spiles there because the river runs under all of them.
Yes.
And the question of ownership of the land even yet, as to whether those people really do own that.
Over the bridge, more or less, in a manner of speaking.
No. But I might mention in connection with the mills, as children think of mills today, of course, Lowell was, in addition to being a lumbering town, as soon as they cleared this land, they went into agriculture and tried to raise agricultural products.
Because
and of course, the mill was a place where they would take their grains and have it prepared for feed, as well as buying just flour like they produce today. And of course, everybody did all their own home-baked, home cooking. But they largely didn't have their own flour made and their own wheat. They would take it to these mills. A lot of it was what we'd call custom work. And we have very few mills left in the United States anywhere today that do custom work. The new types now are mounted on an automobile chassis, and they go right to the places and grind the farmers' grain.
Oh, yes, I remember. My brother was a farmer, and yes, they do this. That's right.
So the old mills, that's the old mill in Lowell, the old King Mill, the one that they tore down was the one here on the east side of the river. That's where the parking lot is. Now, this was the first one that was built. And then the one on the west side burned while we were in Lansing. And of course, this new one that's built there hasn't been only just a comparatively few years, the one with the big silos and all.
Yeah.
But the milling industry is historic. One of the early various things that they really needed when the pioneers came in here, but it's practically passed out of existence now. King can tell you how few mills are left in the whole state of Michigan, even the whole United States, that are running successfully today. It's very, very few of them. And of course, then along with that, Laurel had a cooper shop where they made all the barrels, largely to ship the flour was their biggest customer. But that was right under the seats at the showboat in the building underneath there on the bank of the river. And of course, we used to go in there and watch all these coopers, as they called them. They would soak these staves and these barrel rims out in Flat River and then bring them in and assemble them and nail up and fit the staves together and put the head in them. And of course, they had to be tight enough so they'd hold flour without leaking, you see. And that was a big business. It was a specialized...
Well, they must have stored and shipped many, many things in barrels in those days.
Oh, they did.
Not only flour, but what else?
Well, of course, liquors primarily.
Oh, yes, of course.
Although that took a different type of barrel because they were even charcoaled on the inside and were built of hardwood, where these didn't necessarily have to be.
I see, because it wasn't liquid.
That's right. And then the old Train's Opera House, this Jarve Train was one of the first ones, and he built this 3-story building, and that was the only opera house in the world. Was where Beecham's is now. That was a 3-story building, and the opera house, all the graduation exercises and everything from all the schools were up on the 3rd floor there. Of course, that's been condemned for many, many years now. But when I was a boy, they built the building at where the bowling alley is now, which was the Eastward School.
Oh, yes.
And when that was complete, I remember going to the dedication of it. I'd started the school in the old wooden white school in Lowell, and we were transferred up there in about the 3rd and 4th grade. I even have pictures of the way we were dressed.
Oh, yes. And
in those days, and the teachers, and I can remember all the teachers as well as though it was yesterday. But Lowell has progressed. There's no question about it. Sometimes I wonder whether it's for better or worse, because we still used to have wonderful times. I can remember when the first Baudette or 5-cent theater come into Lowell, and of course that was quite a thing. And now we have television and all these things. It's difficult for these children to realize that we ever got along without electric lights and without all of these things that we just take for granted.
They assume that we must have had no fun at all, I think.
I think so. But I still think that we used to look forward in school to a sleigh ride all winter long, and we would go to Saranac on one side of the river, and then we'd have somebody up there prepare an oyster stew or something like that, and we'd all pile out and thaw out and then come back on the other side of the river, and that was an event to look forward to.
Oh, yes. Well, I do think that one thing, perhaps, because of the kind of fast way in which we live today, our children experience so many, many things that they really, none of them stand out as being special. And I think this is perhaps the advantage that you had as a child, that there were not so many, and so each one was, you anticipated it, and you enjoyed it, and then you look back on it with a lot of fun and interesting thoughts, and there was quite a little area of time that went into this.
Well, I think that we too were in a lot closer relationship with God, just because of the recreational things. We had to go out and find our own pleasures, and we knew my grandmother knew every plant and herb that grew in the woods.
Now, did she use those for medicine?
Oh, yes, they did. And they'd gather all these different things themselves and store them in their own attics. And they knew, she could tell the difference between false Solomon seal and true Solomon seal and all of these old herbs. And
do you know of any of these that we might, or if we were really good enough to pick them out in the woods, that once upon a time were used in terms of medicine?
We have lots of these growing right here and things. I have these all put in this story on our plant life that we've made right here on this place. The little first little things that come up in the spring that appear above the ground. The Indians gathered these and used them to clean their pots and pans, and even dried them, because that's they would.
That would be like our scouring powder, or like our SOS
pads? The base of those things in those days. See, and we have lots of things here that they gathered the roots of and ate for food that are going right along our trout stream.
Oh, yeah.
So and a lot of the herbs that they would use for their medicinal things, heal all of these things go right here on our own place. Now, I have those worked up in a separate story.
Yeah. I do think that one of the things that I would like to do next year is to use you, perhaps as a speaker, hadn't thought about incorporating the whole grade school, but perhaps we might. But at least for, say, the second grades, when I don't know exactly.
When they have pictures, they
it means more.
I think they tie these things with it easier than they do just listening to a tape or anything like this. Because
well, I think this pretty much has to be for my information.
Yes. So, and you probably don't want this to last too long for your children anyhow. I mean.
Well, we have to pick out, as I said, highlights.
Yeah.
But I don't know what they could be until I hear some of them. You see, this is the thing. Now, what were some of the other early things? They had a lumbering industry. Now, you mentioned some of the lumberman stories that you'd heard. Were there any of those that would interest 7-year-olds?
Well, I don't think so, because actually that took place by people that lived a few miles. We never had the big lumber camps.
Mm-hmm.
They built hotels here, and they would come in here for their weekends, I suppose, to spend their money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But actually, it was from Greenville on north that the lumber industry centered in this part. And the last float of lumber went down through Lowell. Well, it was after I was born, but before I was big enough to go down and see it. And they followed it through with a float boat that the cooks and everything rode on. But that was the last one.
Would that be maybe when you were 3, 4?
3 or 4 years old. It would be previous to 1900. It'd be between 1894. I had a picture of that somewhere in my files. It was the last one that came down through Lowell.
Most interesting.
And of course, this was before the railroad bridge went through Lowell. You see that there was the Pure Marquette was not even built or anything. We had just a one railroad, and that was the reason that originally Lowell started over on Seaguam, the Grand Trunk.
Yes, I've heard that.
Than where it is at the present time. And it was after the railroads came into Lowell that they switched and went to the river. And of course, then these dams were the only means of power.
Power for the mills.
The old cutter factory had both steam and water power, and King Milling Company operated with water power and still does. Of course, now they've supplemented a lot with electric power.
He told me today, or the other day, that if he could do it again, now, if he were going to start from scratch, he would never utilize the water because it's more trouble than it would be worth.
There's consumers who are taking out all of their
dams,
plants, and spreading all the other means nowadays. But these are all some of the changes, because a lot of these old dams and everything that even furnished our electric power are gone now. They're not on the Flat River anymore, where we used to go and skate and have our good times here.
Now, you mentioned hotels. How many did Lowell have originally?
Well, the one on the east side of the town, where the recent supermarket closed out.
Oh, Super Save.
Super Save. That was the Davis house when I was a boy, and then there was 1 or 2 that are gone that were on in back of where Bruce McQueen lives there. And then, of course, there was the Trains Hotel. The same train that built the Opera House also built a 3-story hotel, and that's a part of what was the Root Lowell Company. It's the building on the corner. They've taken it down to a 2-story, but that was a 3-story building. And then there were 2 or 3 kind of second-rate boarding houses and hotels that were along the riverbank, right north of the 5 and 10 cent store.
Oh yes, little Frank.
Big Frank's place there, and practically all of those are gone now. But Lowell used to have a big transient population that would come in from employment, part-time employment, part-year employment, mostly in the lumber industry. Although after the cutter factory started, and that ran on a year-round basis, that's when the real Lowell began to grow, because it was a permanent population.
And
it's quite stable.
Yes, and they needed employees, and the people needed work.
Yes, and then we went through a period of time in Lowell when it was called Farmers Town, and these farmers looked forward to retirement and moved into Lowell, and it was largely just a retirement. And nowadays, that's just another thing almost of the past.
Yes, yes.
But Lowell catered a lot to these retired farmers, and of course, they didn't demand the amount of amusements and things. They just wanted a place convenient to stores, and as you say, shopping. And of course, the women mostly made their own dresses and their own clothing. So as you say, instead of selling ready-made garments in those days, I used to go with my mother and sit and wait and she used to send me for patterns. She used to do a lot of dressmaking. They bought a pattern for 15 cents in those days.
Now we might spend 50 to 75 or $1.
Yes, or more. And of course, women were just as proud of their, I think maybe a little bit more so, of their own handiwork in making their clothing.
Now, I presume you probably remember, Mother has told me about important picnic in the summer. It was a July picnic, or no, an August picnic, in which the ladies who were really well dressed wore their best black silk dresses, and And they were long sleeves, of course, and they went through the ground.
Puff sleeves. I have some of those old pictures. WRC, the woman, my grandmother was a charter member of what they call the Women's Relief Corps.
Oh,
my
yeah.
grandfather fought in the Civil War. And boy, those people did take that occasion, and did they look nice? I'm telling you that they were really beautiful.
But you know, when I think about a long sleeve silk dress in August, I think I would melt.
Well,
but they must
survive it because
they were undoubtedly used to it.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is pictures of the clothing worn when Laurel was a long time ago would be interesting to boys and girls in second grade.
Well, quite often we get some of those sent in here from people from other states where they just happen to borrow one out of the family somewhere, and then we restore them and because most of those are pretty well faded.
Yes,
and
I know. I've
seen
seen some.
Important part of our work is showing these old pictures, and some are really beautiful.
I'm sure that's true.
Their hairstyles and their clothing and everything was very immaculate. And of course, the high waist.
Oh yeah. Well, and when you think about the way they had to wash and iron, even, it's amazing that they looked nice like that. And the bathtubs, they had no bathrooms similar to what we have today. That's for sure.
Well, my grandmother always made her own soft soap.
Yes.
Their wood ashes, even from the stove, the kitchen stove. You know.
This would be much like they do down at the museum during Michigan Week.
Well, they do that in Ford Village in Illinois.
In Detroit.
I mean Abraham Lincoln Village in Illinois.
In New Salem. Yes,
Salem.
I've seen that. Well, I went down to the museum during Michigan Week and bought a couple of bars of their homemade soap, just, I think it's for fun, along a couple of candles and so on. What else, in terms of either businesses or factories, did Lowell have way early?
Well, we had about 5 blacksmith shops in Lowell because everything was horse-drawn.
Yes.
I mean, all of the farm work was done. All of the teams that delivered in Lowell, the mills, the cutter factory and everything, employed horse-drawn to take their products over to warehouses, to the depots, you see.
No trucks, because all of them were wagons and teams.
Long before there was any automobiles even dreamed of. And I can remember the first automobile that ran up and down on the streets of Lowell.
Who had it?
Well, Earl English. It wasn't he manufactured it himself. He was the superintendent of the first Lowell electric light plant.
Oh!
And he built this, and we could hear him. My folks lived up 4 blocks from Main Street, but we could hear that coming, and so we'd run out to the corner to get a look at this automobile and go down the street.
Did people feel he was very foolish to have had it?
I think that the reaction of most people of an automobile was more of a curiosity, the same as the steamboat and the first railroad train. I don't think anyone at that time was dreaming of their future potential, you know, because, of course, even after you had these cars that they'd run satisfactorily, we had no roads in the whole state of Michigan that were suitable for even inter-town travel. Because Lowell was just, you could get in the ruts, the sand ruts here, and go all the way to Ada if you didn't meet a team, and then that touched the steering wheel on the first cars that I drove.
Yes, I'm sure that's true.
And of course, the farmers that had horses detested them because they were all so noisy that you had to either, of course, you'd hear them coming a block or 2 away, but they could hold the horses, or the horses would run away and were frightened at them. So they had their problems and had to prove some of their worth, but of course the cost which you could buy an automobile soon became low enough so that today the price of a second-hand car would buy a lot of the new cars.
Oh my, yes. Now, am I right in thinking that Henry Ford was very influential in this economy kind of car that the average person could buy?
That was his. Of course, that's why he put this line production, and was the first one that started to build them in quantities enough so that the price could get down where the common man could buy a car. And of course, then he was also instrumental in raising labor prices so that people could make enough money to make an honest living. So you have to give Henry Ford credit a lot for a lot that he has contributed to America through the automobile industry. I think that, and I don't think he was nearly as money-minded as far as the amount of resources he was going to accumulate. I think that came as a surprise to him almost.
Probably.
You know.
He probably had no idea that it would, I mean, he might have envisioned, but it would be more in the angle of a dream.
Because when he built these first ones in this little old bicycle shop, it took a lot of imagination to think of those huge plans.
I'm sure that's right. I'm sure that's right.
But this is just the way things change in our world. It's just like the first airplane that the Wright brothers built. Nobody dreamed that today we could be traveling from here to New York City in just a matter almost of minutes, you know.
And just a little bit more, you can go to Europe.
Yes.
And literally around the world in ridiculously
when I went to
small.
France in World War I, we were 18 days crossing the Atlantic, and nowadays, of course, our grandsons have been crossed here and back and all these foreign countries in just a matter of hours.
Now, I remember livery stables. I don't think boys and girls today would know what a livery stable was. Could you tell us about any of the livery stables?
Well, there were several livery stables. Of course, this was people's main. If a family that didn't have a car, of course, the wealthy people, instead of having a garage, they had a barn and they had a driving horse.
Oh, yes.
And these pretty buggies with the
Fringe on top?
Fringe on top, you know, the Peckhams, and there were a few of those in Lowell. But the other people that wanted to visit relatives, even, say, 15, 18 miles, I remember my mother had a sister in Belding, and we would go on Saturday and rent a livery horse, and then we'd go up there, and then, of course, we'd put it in their barn up there, and they provided the feed, and we could start back Saturday afternoon and get back here. It was 18 miles, but it was about, I'd say probably a 4-hour trip with the buggy, and it was something we looked forward to. It was a real experience in those days.
And you did it oftener than we do it perhaps now.
And many people, even on a Sunday afternoon, where now they take an automobile ride, would go down and rent a livery rig and drive to Saranac and back, or to Ada and back, or
even drivers
farms around,
even there.
because even people in the country, it was your way to visit with your neighbors if they lived out of walking distance, the horse and buggy. And they were very popular. They had nice driving rigs, and they kept these horses looking very neat and well-trained and gentle, so that the person who was not an expert driver was quite safe with the livery rig.
This would really, in a way, be the forerunner of either the rent-a-car or a taxi service, wouldn't it?
It was a combination of both. And then, of course, the thing that preceded those was really and that still was horse and buggy travel, was the old stagecoaches. And they came through, and they also maintained their barns because they had to change horses, you see, and freshen, and they had a place to put them in overnight. And so they would have certain of these stagecoach inns where they would make their nightly stops and also have a change of horses for the next day's trip if it was especially hard on the teams that they had at that time. And Lowell had some of the first ones. There was one up at Walker's Inn. That was still standing when I was a boy, Walker Tavern.
Now, where would that be?
Well, it was up on that corner from Fox's Corners West on Virginia's Drive, right about the top, just beyond that little trout stream in there. In fact, there's a house stands there on that property now. Harold Jeffries built a house shortly after they tore down the old one. And my grandmother used to go there to dances.
Oh, yeah.
And they were community centers as well, too, you know.
The taverns were really a place to go and have fun.
And, of course, there's one of those still in Fowlsburg that was still used, the building that stands east of the Fowlsburg Bridge there now that we hope to restore as restoration of Fowlsburg Village. And the old barns were just across the street, and that building has been rebuilt into a house. So we still have, and there used to be a lot of these old inns. There's more of them yet over and around Somerset, over in the Irish Hills, that they have preserved there as historic preservation. As I can remember it back, of course, the railroad did take over the post. We had men that traveled, that lived in Lowell, the mail trains. And it was an important part of the railroad. They had this mail coach in which they sorted the mail between stations. And Frank Coons, who was originally one of the owners of the Coons clothing store, was one of the men that you'd get down at night, and his wife would take him down to lunch, and they'd go on through, and then he'd come back, and he'd have his weekends in Lowell. But there was nothing that I ever remember in Lowell, because we had two railroads available, both the Grand Trunk and the C&O, what is the C&O now. So that took care of us pretty well here. But previous to that, the old, the same stagecoaches carried the mail.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, they were
like buses do today.
Just like buses do today. And that was an important part. And, of course, that was the thing that caused so many of these robberies on the stagecoaches. It wasn't for the money that the people on the stagecoach were carrying. It was the payrolls and money traveling to banks and so forth that these bandits were interested in, rather than, although they robbed the people while they were at it.
Oh, yes, yes. They didn't miss anything. According to the Westerns we see now, of course, all boys and girls will have seen Westerns and know about the stagecoaches. Was there any stagecoach, was there a stagecoach station around Laurel or anything in that, do you know of about history in that respect?
I think that the ones that I would recall, see, they didn't come down these river valleys because of the winter storms, the snows. They kept on top of the hills back. So they were over on more what would be, as 21 runs higher as it gets east of Ionian, up that way. And they were around Lyons, some of these early old towns that are further east and up on the higher ground, rather than coming down through the river valley on account of travel restrictions. through the village of Lowell, either north or south.
You mentioned the traveling ministers they had a long time ago. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, the first churches that they had, even the first of the Methodist Church, was a minister that would come in and call just the people together out in a field and would perhaps stay at some of the people's homes and establish headquarters and conduct their services in that way. They were really had to love their work to come in that way. They had a regular route in which they would come.
So this was a circuit on the Methodist,
wasn't it? That was a circuit, and it was established under the management of the Methodist Church. They established these churches even that long ago through the conference. And then later, as there was enough interest, why they formed a church organization and built a building, you see.
Do you have
this is the nucleus of this.
Do you know which is the oldest church?
The Baptist Church in Lowell is the old Baptist Church where Norton Borgeson was the first one built. Well, I have the dates on
that. Yes, the one that he has turned into an antique shop.
And I have the date which the Methodist Church was built here, and I underlined a few of these.
Oh, all right. Maybe you could give us that data, if you don't mind.
Let's see if I can. This is pretty well depleted here. There. It was Methodist Episcopal at that time.
Yes.
It was built in 1860. And it was built on the same site as where this little red schoolhouse had been.
Which is now the Methodist Church site still, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And this May 30th in 1835, this Marsac purchased from the general government a portion of Section 11. This was, and he was the one that later ran this little store and married this Indian girl. And then this is some of the story that if you were interested in the kind of the romance of this. And then later he fell in love with a white girl, and then of course and let his colored girl go, his Indian girl, and then the Indians wouldn't trade with him anymore. So he sold on. This is where he sold to my great-grandfather. This is when Abel Avery purchased the whole east side of Lowell and planted that, and that was when Lowell started to grow on the east side of the river. Before that, it had been divided into two and even a different name on the west side of the river.
Oh, and what was the name of it on the west side?
Well, let's see. The Lowell Furniture Factory. This is another furniture factory in Lowell was over where Gordon Johnson lives. It was built on Coffs Creek over there, and that was built in 1867.
Oh, yeah.
And these Superior Mills were built in 1865.
Oh, this has been in Lowell for a long, long time then, Superior Furniture.
Well, no, that wasn't the same.
Oh, I see.
This furniture followed when the automotive industry, when they talked about turning it into, the cutter factory, when they started to talk about metalworking, they built that plant where the Superior Furniture is.
I see.
And they never occupied it. They would have to switch to metalworking and away from woodworking. And there never was, we did make cutters and buggies in there, and we built the first automobile body for the old Austin Automobile in Grand Rapids, which was an all-wooden body.
Oh!
And we built that in that plant.
I see. How interesting. Now, when did you leave? When did you stop working for the cutter factory?
Well, I went in to learn my work, and I still work there all the time I was serving my apprenticeship. I paid $50 and served 6 months, which you wouldn't think of young people doing today. They have to have money from the first time they go.
You paid to learn, in other words,
I paid to learn. And that was in 1910, and I think that we built that. I had to go to noon and make this picture, so that they shut down all of the machinery in the plant, so we wouldn't get any vibration while we photographed this body. And I'd say it was about 1910, 11, or 12 right along in that.
Most interesting.
Because that was the time that I started in business in Lowell, and. While this is all in quite detail here, I think that there's some very interesting things in here that would answer a lot of your questions.
Well, now, the Baptist Church was the first church. I think you said.
Yes.
And it was at the site where that antique shop is that Norton Borgeson had.
Now, we were talking about the first Methodist preacher who visited the settlement was Elder Mitchell, a minister from the Ohio Conference. So that was even before Michigan had set up a conference
of its own. Wasn't well enough settled, apparently.
That's right. And in 1850, Mr. Hooker built the first frame schoolhouse in the village on the east part of the county. It occupied the site of the present M.E. Church and was known as the Red Schoolhouse. And then it tells about when Marsac disposed of his holdings, land to Abel Avery. He added 100. Abel Avery had 100 acres to the original plat. That made a great-great-grandfather. The village of Dansville was Dansville on the west side of the river, and he called. And the nucleus of Lowell was formed. That would be in 1850.
1850.
And about that time, Lowell Township contained 62 voters. There were just 62 voters in Lowell Township.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine that? I don't know how many thousand participated in the last school election, for instance, or a last political election, but it would be lots more than 62. And even then, we didn't probably get too good a percentage of voters.
And the first, Lowell built a water plant at first. The first one was built up at the east end of Main Street and back down Grand River, but it was unsatisfactory. And later, when they built the first dam up north of Lowell, about where the Boy Scout cabin is there,
yeah.
Then the electric company took over the pumping of the water for Lowell, and they built the reservoir up on top of the hill, somewhere near where the one is up there now. It isn't the same one. But they pumped the water and pumped it up in there for the village of Lowell rather than operating this old steam plant that they built up on Grand River here. But the remains of that was up there when I was a boy. And,
you know, I have heard that from someone, I mean to talk to the man at the Power and Light yet, but do you know anything about this, someone who helped in the building of some dam, and then he was asked what they could do for him, and he said he'd like to have electricity on his farm. And if I have it straight, this would be our third grade teacher's, Mrs. Bowen's, where she lives, on the farm which she lives now, Fred Bowen's farm. Is that, you know?
Well, that would probably, that's up near White's Bridge, if I recall correctly.
Well, I know it's that way, but well, I think
there's an electric light plant up there, and if their wires go right by their place, so they probably could get, and that originally was our cooperative effort between Lowell and Belding, that plant when it was built, and half the power went to Belding and half of it to Lowell, and then later Belding built their own and Lowell took it over, and now they've abandoned that. But there was another plant on down this way that, well, there were two other plants on down the river. And of course there's quite a story connected with the very first one. A man by the name of Church had this big vision of a great plant, and he was also the president of one of the first banks in Lowell.
Oh!
And they started to build a dam up there, and they evidently had it well engineered, but they went bankrupt, and this man took his own life, this Church.
Because it was a disappointment, such a disappointment he couldn't fight.
Financially didn't work out some way or other. But later on, the Consumers Power Company came in and followed out that plan and followed right over this old horseshoe that we called it and built that plant, which has now been abandoned, and carried it through because they had it laid out.
And actually worked it.
It was a working plan, but they just didn't. Of course, when these dams were built up here, it was all done with Italian labor and horse-drawn shovels. No.
Now, that would be migrant labor, wouldn't it?
Yes. I can tell you a story about that.
All right.
I can remember when my grandmother lived right next door to my mother, and these women would talk over the fence in the backyard and talk about Lowell, what terrible thing was going to be to have all these Bagels coming into Lowell. Women wouldn't be safe in their own yard, you know. And they had me scared to death as a little kid. I was probably about 4 or 5, 6 years old maybe. And one Sunday, we decided to take a trip up there and see all of these Bagels. And of course I was quite skeptical about it, but here they were living in tents, camps up on that side hill up there, and they had their guitars or banjos, I don't remember which, but I never saw a more peaceful group of people in my life, and they were playing out there and singing, and they never did molest anybody, but this is the way that people imagine all of these things and make a big thing out of it, and of course that stays in my mind, you know, it's one of the things that we remembered, but it never did.
Well, that was a silly, prejudice, shall I say, as some of the ones we
just like
today.
This.
Yes, that
there were prejudices back then, just as much.
Oh yes, I'm afraid we haven't lost it any. Were there any other things that you did to entertain yourselves? Because as in that time, you had to make your own way of having fun that you think would be interesting to boys and girls today.
Well, I think that if the people in the ski industry today could realize the fun that we got out of the simplest types of thing, we'd go to the old barrel factory and get a couple of staves and be sure we picked the right way of the grain on it so that it would stay smooth, and put a couple of leather straps on it, and we were in business. We didn't have to spend $150 for a suit and clothing, and we did, in those days, we'd wax our shoes with tallow and put them in the oven at night and soak them in so that they'd become waterproof, because it was a disgrace to wear galoshes or rubbers.
Well, I know some boys today who think that it's true also.
And, of course, we had all these hills available around Lowell, and sliding and skiing were practical in those days because they didn't plow the roads all out, so we could slide with the slide
way to school.
Long ways. Well, we had hills that you could ride a mile or two, and of course these skis all lead little valleys on all these hills around here, and we could just have loads of fun. And we even built jumps, and well, we didn't jump as far as they jump now, but we could jump 4, 5, 6 feet, so it was a lot of thrills.
Well, considering the homemade kind of ski you had, you probably did very well.
But these were the forerunners of the skiing.
And the industry, which now Michigan is even a part of in terms of recreation. Right. Now, is the nearest skiing place now Canonsburg?
Yes. The Caracas boys did start one, Shushaway, right at the East Village limits. But they were both, two of these boys were in the ski service in World War II.
Oh.
And they come back and built, but they were pioneers too far ahead of their time then.
Just didn't take it.
Proper.
Now, over at Bertha Brock Park, we went with toboggans last year. Now, did you have anything like toboggans when you were a child?
No. In fact, this one that I think at Bertha Brock Park has been one of the most successful toboggan slides around this part of the country because they're still almost sticking entirely to toboggan.
Yes. I found it lots of fun. You do get cold, of course, but it was, by the time you get it pulled back up again, while you worked up a little, your blood's running and so forth.
Well, the summer variation of that was the old
swimming hole.
Well, and the derby racers that they used to build, at the amusement centers where...
That reminds me of something else. What about horse racing in Lowell?
Old Lowell used to be a great horse racing center. In fact, Lowell had 2 racetracks. They had fairgrounds north of Lowell on the same site where the Atwood Brass is now, right?
Oh.
There was a half-mile track there. The old fairgrounds were still there when I was a boy. And then there was a fairgrounds where a recreation park is at present, and a racetrack. And then there used to be over where the city service had their underground storage plant. There was a man had a big raised blooded horses there and had a half-mile track right where that plant is.
Oh.
And I can remember when that barn burned and several of the horses burned there. That was John Matheson. But Lowell was such a great horse racing town that all the stores would close and everybody just simply went to the horse races. And people would come here from all these surrounding villages here and they'd have these races perhaps every 2 weeks in the summertime and draw just tremendous crowds of people.
Would this be Saturday afternoon or something?
Or Thursday afternoon.
Thursday.
And of course, same way when they used to have, each town had their own ball team. Everybody in town patronized the semi-pro ball team. And that's before they played baseball or football in the schools, you see.
Oh, yes.
And they had sort of a semi-pro team, and everyone went. And the farmers all took a half day off and came in Lowell and bet their money on their ball team.
Oh, yeah. So that went along with it, of course.
So we had amusements of different kinds. And then, of course, for the summertime, these little traveling Chautauqua courses.
Oh, yes. Now, I noticed there's a tent over here on the corner of Old 16 and...
Yeah, well, that's a church organization. But they were similar to that, only they did bring in very fine talent.
Yes, they were...
traveling talent.
They were almost similar to the kinds of things that you might bring to junior highs and high schools today in terms of kinds of programs, weren't they?
Well, during the winter months, these same people came in as lecturers. We put on a winter lecture course.
At the Opera House.
At the Opera House. And these prominent men that,
Would this be like what is now the Chamber of Commerce, perhaps?
Well, no, I don't know if we had any organization. I don't know who did sponsor that, for sure. But anyhow, they sold season tickets. And you get all these problems. I can remember well even when William Hart Taft came here.
Oh.
To Lowell and spoke on the...
and that would be a presidential candidate, right?
Yeah.
And today, Lowell probably would never get...
no, I don't mean William Hart Taft. I mean Bryan.
Oh, yes.
But
wasn't he he was a presidential?
Yes, he was. He tried it many times and never made it.
But he was an excellent orator, if I recall.
He was. That's the one that I meant when I said that. Because... And when I was a boy, in about the 4th grade in school, I can remember when President McKinley was killed, we all wore little black bands on our arms and had to go to a special service down on the islands. That's where Lowell had for all of their things years ago, was down on Island Park, the island.
Where was that?
Well, it was down where the railroad tracks cross over there now, right south of Main Street. All Flat River and that, those were all mowed and kept up and had bandstands and grandstands on them.
That was like the city park, in a manner of speaking.
That was before recreation park even existed.
Oh, I see. Now in Lowell, we really have a very fine swimming program, I think, today. Now, I'm sure that probably you grew up in the era in which if you wanted to learn to swim, your dad took you out and tossed you in, and you had to fight to swim in order to survive, more or less.
Well, we just learned with the gang of kids, and we all went up what the kids in Lowell always called Delk swimming hole. It's right up on the back of the schoolhouse, on up about half a mile
the high school
there on the east side of the Flat River Bank. And there was a channel in there, and it was about 20 feet, and if we get so we could swim across that, then we could undertake a little, but we never dreamed of such a thing as a heated pool, and even a place to change your clothing. We'd sometimes put on our bathing suit underneath our clothing before we left home, otherwise it changed right back to the river.
Of course. Now, in this picture of the school where you went as about a 4th grader, where would that be located today?
Well, this would be a part of what is now the American Legion building and the bowling alley. It would be the main building, the brick part that faces the street, and the entrance, you can still imagine what it was there, but it's been closed up and they've made another entrance. But the inside of the building, the rooms are very much the same as they were, the hallways and the recitation room.
Was it a 1-story room?
2-story building.
A 2-story
and
building,
and the toilets and everything were in the basement even that long ago.
Oh,
and the central heating plant. So this was considered a very modern school when that was built.
And that was 1902.
1902. Well, it was probably built about 1900 and 1901. And I remember when I went to the dedication of it, the Lowell band being there, and everybody in Lowell went to inspect the building. And of course, then soon after, period of years, where the ward school began to be a thing of the past, just like the country schools.
Now, why was it called a ward school? Does this mean like
they had them? There were 4
certain sections or districts. This was a district school. You might use.
Well,
is that what that means?
The southward Lowell extended across the Grand River over towards the Grand Trunk, and there was a southward school up on the top of the hill. And then there was one on the east side, and the westward, which is a part of now Newell's manufacturing plant.
Yes, I heard that there was one there.
Right there.
Used to teach
Oh, did
there.
you? What did you teach there?
1st and 2nd grade.
And how many would you have in a 1st and 2nd grade class?
Oh, about up towards 30.
And this would be in about what time? What year?
Well, it was during the First World War.
So, 1919, 1918,
18 and 19.
Oh, yeah.
And
Well, then you had 30 pupils then. Of course, 15 approximately were 1st graders and 15 were 2nd graders.
But of course, there were 3 of those different schools that were a part of the Lowell school system. Besides, then of course they didn't go to the central schools until they got into the 5th grade. It started there 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, and then the high school was upstairs.
Norton was it the 6th grade instead of 5th?
No, we just went through the 4th grade here, and then we had to go back to the old Central High School again for 5th grade.
Central High School, and that was located where junior high is today.
That's right.
So one of them was where the Newell Manufacturing Company is, and one of them was where the bowling alley and skating rink is, and one of them was where
the southward was up on the top of the hill. There's people aren't living now. There's a driveway leads up to it, but you can't even see it when you drive along below. You wouldn't even know it was up there.
On Seagram or on
east of Seagram, between that and the upper bridge, what we call the 2 bridges there.
I see.
And I remember getting excused in the 8th grade when my uncle was teaching over there, and that's southward school, and going over there and playing Santa Claus for them, and walked in to surprise all the kids and help distribute the presents.
And because you were not known and your voice wouldn't be known, you could do this. This was an interview I recorded with Norton Avery of 36th Street, Lowell, on the afternoon of June 30th, 1970. At this time, he is 76 years old. Jesse B. Price.
Island.
The Lowell Area Historical Museum is proud to sponsor community oral history interviews. The Lowell Area Historical Museum educates, enriches, and inspires our community and visitors through the preservation and presentation of Lowell area history. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.